Hello, I'd like to talk today about a very major and very difficult text in philosophy. It is the Phenomenology of Mind, sometimes Phenomenology of Spirit, by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. And we're going to be reading and thinking about the specific little bit of it called the dialectic of Lordship and Bondage, sometimes referred to also as the dialectic of mastery and slavery. My friend Robert Merton quotes Isaac Newton, who said, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." And of course, Merton, in his somewhat well-known underground book On the Shoulders of Giants, actually traces that phrase back to a monk, Bernard of Clairvaux. It's worth reading. It is indeed an underground classic. And this is relevant today because when we think about Hegel, Hegel is somebody who stands on the shoulders of giants. He stood on the shoulders of Aristotle, of Descartes, and of Kant, among others. And he has had a tremendous influence subsequently as people have stood on his shoulders. Folks like Feuerbach, Karl Marx, Nietzsche, Sartre, Weber, Durkheim, Freud, George Herbert Mead, Charles Horton Cooley, David Riesman, Herbert Marcuse, John Kenneth Galbraith, and others have stood on the shoulders of Hegel. Some of these stood directly on Hegel's shoulders in as much as they knew his work and they elaborated on it, whereas others stood on the hand. Some of the things that they tend to be made independently, but roughly the same, roughly simultaneous is what I'm say. For example, Newton and Leibniz worked out calculus independently of one another. Darwin and Wallace both worked out a theory of evolution about the same time and independently. Of course, Darwin beat Wallace to the publication, and that's, of course, what garners scientific standing. And so we call it Darwin's theory of evolution rather than Wallace's, although we might well have done it the other way around. Watson and Crick, now some 67 years ago, published the structure of the DNA code. Very, very important discovery. Linus Pauling, right behind them, and indeed might have gotten the Nobel Prize had he published first. He didn't. So it is Watson and Crick's account of DNA rather than Linus Pauling's that we credit. I think it's interesting that Hegel both influenced some major thinkers directly, but with other major thinkers, he rang multiples. Both of these things are true. Now, let's look at Hegel in terms of the way that he stood on the shoulders of Immanuel Kant with respect to two basic ideas, autonomy and phenomenology. And we've already talked about autonomy in the previous lecture from the transition, German idealism from Descartes to Sartre, as I like to put it, somewhat tongue-in-cheek. From Kant, Hegel gets from his epistemology the notion of phenomena, and from Kant's ethics, Hegel gets the notion of autonomy. Now, it's worth commenting, there are several philosophers who had young and mature phases that were very different, and Hegel is one of them. Young Hegel is a radical Kantian. Older Hegel has a reputation, it may not be deserved, as a conservative philosopher of law and politics, servant of the Prussian state, certainly was that. Young Marx was a follower of Hegel, and Feuerbach raised existential questions. The older, more mature Marx, spokesman for what he liked to call scientific socialism, perhaps a little embarrassed by his younger enthusiasm. Certainly many of his followers were. So it's as if they were two different Marxes. And Ludwig Wittgenstein, in another context, wrote this tremendous work on logic, very systematic, and in his younger days, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. And in his later days, Wittgenstein was a bit of a mystic. There's no job for philosophy. It's just to show the fly the way out of the fly bottle, as he put it. Coincidentally, each of these three philosophers I mentioned who had these radically distinct early and young periods reckoned that philosophy ended with him. Hegel tries to tell us the story of spirit, its alienation, and its overcoming of that alienation, and his philosophy, he thinks, is that very overcoming. Marx looks at philosophy and says, look, philosophers have hitherto only described the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. So Marx thinks that philosophy ends in political activism and politics, philosophy, and economics, basically. And Wittgenstein thinks that it ends in therapy. So young Hegel was a radical Kantian. That's the first thing to note about him. Again, as he matured, he would be seen as the establishment philosopher of the Prussian state. Some people also, by the way, read Kant that way too. What they both had in common was that they had to be careful politically. They were both employees of the state. They had to toe the line. Marx, the reason Marx is known to us today, Marx was a philosophy major who wanted to be a professor, but politics prevented it. He found his way around elsewhere as a journalist, sitting there in the British Library, writing his famous works that we now think of as economics, but basically started as a philosopher. Might have just been an obscure philosophy professor in the German provinces had it not been for his political choices. And one of the ways in which Hegel was cautious is that he did not publish his youthful writings in his lifetime. They only came to light about a century later. Something similar also happened with Marx. Hegel's radical youthful followers were called left Hegelians. By analogy, and this is not a standard term, but I think we could see Hegel as a left Kantian. Now, autonomy. Hegel is going to want to talk about the logistics of autonomy, which is a bit different than Kant's moral emphasis on autonomy. Again, this is a review. Autonomy comes from Greek words, autos, self, like an automobile is self-propelled, nomos is governance or rule or law. Kant is the modern philosopher of ethical duty, the modern philosopher of ethical duty, also the philosopher of human freedom. For Kant, duty and freedom are not opposed, they go hand in glove. And for Kant, if we are behaving morally, we are behaving also autonomously. Kant famously had a deontic approach to ethics, that is one in terms of duty. But for Kant, duty is not just what the drill sergeant or the priest tells me. It is not an external command. It is the free embrace by each individual of what reason declares. Reason being individual capacity for universality, what that shows me to be imperative as I myself reflect upon that. And recall that Kant's ethical view promoted autonomy to a very central place. Only a free person could be said to be acting morally. If you do the right thing, but for the wrong reason, if you do it for a servile reason, you think, should I rob a bank? I got, too much month and too little money. And you say, well, I better not because I'm afraid of the cops. You're doing it for the wrong reason. You're doing it heteronomically. If you, though, reflect as a good philosophy student now preparing to rob a bank, but you remember your Kant, and you say, wait a minute, I can't will this universally. Then you're doing the right thing and for the right reason. Each of us has equal duties for Kant, and that is only because each also has equal capacities for free and rational choice. Now, Kant is sometimes thought of as a sort of goody two-shoes, whereas Nietzsche is a badass. But on this particular point, Kant and Nietzsche are in alignment. Doing the right thing should be done optimally for the right reasons. Of all evil I deem you capable, says Nietzsche, therefore I want good from you. Verily, I have often laughed at the weaklings who thought themselves good because they had no claws. And Kant basically says the same thing. You should do the good even though and because perhaps you are capable of doing otherwise, but you choose freely to do the good instead. For Kant, when we're governed by the requirements of morality, what he calls the categorical imperative, we are also being self-governed. Morality is always autonomous, never heteronymous. It's a basic condition for what Aristotle called eudaimonia, human flourishing. So Kant stands, of course, also in that tradition as well. Now, young Hegel follows Kant. He approves of his views on autonomy, but he points out something basic that he thinks Kant has overlooked. And that's this. To the extent that Kant views duty as universal and binding, to that very extent, he makes duty heteronymous and not truly autonomous as he intends to do. Here's what Hegel says in one of his early writings. Between, on the one hand, the obviously heteronymous, those ruled by kings, priests, positive law, etc., and the autonomous Kantian man who, quote, listens to his own command of duty on the other, end quote, the difference is this: not that the former make themselves slaves while the latter is free, but that the former have their lord outside themselves while the latter carries his lord within himself, and yet at the same time is his own slave. Both autonomy, which Kant champions, and heteronomy, which Kant denounces, might just be different versions of basic slavery, at least what Hegel suggests here. It may turn out to be unfreedom rather than freedom, this Kantian autonomy. And this is an early anticipation of what Hegel's going to discuss in the Phenomenology, which we're going to read, of the notion that there can be masterless slavery. Slaves can have actual masters, but there can be masterless slavery too. On the subject of laws as rules, Hegel adds the following. This is a bit of a tongue twister, but get used to it because that is oh so Hegel. He says, and this again is from his early writings, although the legal is a universal whose entire obligatoriness lies in its universality, still, even if every command declares itself as something alien, nevertheless, as concept, universality, it is something subjective. And as subjective, as a product of a human power, that is to say, if reason is the capacity for universality, it loses its objectivity, its positivity, its heteronomy, and the thing commanded is revealed as grounded in an autonomy of the human will. That's a bit of a mouthful. Let's unpack that. It seems to be saying at least four things. First of all, law compels us because, and just to the extent that it is universal and objective, reason is the individual's capacity to become universal, and it works through conceptualization. The German word here for concept is der Begriff, the concept. And it's interesting because its root word is to grasp. And when I have a concept, when I conceptualize something, I grasp it. Thirdly, reason working through conceptualization is also subjective, not just objective. Therefore, number four, even though the law appears to be universal and objective, in fact, it's grounded in subjective autonomy. Now, by taking Kant to task in this way, Hegel is repeating a point that Kant already made. Hegel, in a sense, out-Kants Kant. For Kant had argued this: even the Holy One of the Gospel must first be compared with our ideal of moral perfection before it can be recognized as such. That is to say, even a religious morality which presents itself as the heteronymous rule of a higher power, capitalized, turns out to have exactly as much authority as autonomous human will is prepared to grant it and no more. The voices in my head can't make up my mind. And again, for you guys, this is review. We've talked about this before in the section on ethics. Remember the question of Abraham. He decides that the voice talking to him is the voice of God. Well, it might or might not be. Remember Euthyphro. And why won't Calvin's defense of the divine command theory work? Because the voices in my head can't make up my mind. Only I can do that. Even the Holy One of the Gospel must first be compared with our ideal of moral perfection before we can recognize him to be such. Hegel seems to be saying here, yes, and likewise for any other command, such as the rule of law, the same point applies to law as applies to theology. A command may compel us, as Kant says, insofar as it's universal, but that universality itself is nothing unless it's grasped by a rational concept, a Begriff. And that rational concept is just, it is neither just wholly objective nor universal nor heteronymous, but it is subjective, it is autonomous. And this is in a way also, isn't it, the point that Descartes was trying to make about epistemology. My subjective perception of any putative object which interposes itself between me and anything itself is the product of my power. My percepts are always first and foremost my creations. So if we're going to want to talk about an objective world, as certainly Descartes is going to, and some people today also, there's a big controversy in philosophy of science about realism and so forth. Hegel is making the same point for concepts too that Descartes made. If Kant really means what he says about duty being grounded in freedom, then duty and universality have no more power than I, the subjective consciousness, may be willing to grant them. So how is it possible that I can say I'm duty bound? How can I be bound at all? This line of reasoning, again, about human freedom and freedom and human will was contained in his early writings, what are called the early theological writings, as a number of people have pointed out. Not really, not that much theological about them, but certainly of some interest. These didn't come up, didn't see the light of day, weren't published until the German edition in 1907 and English translation in 1948, which you see here. Sometimes, though, as with the Sorcerer's Apprentice, if you know that story, or the Disney film version, things go further than we intend. There are unintended consequences. Once Hegel's radical early writings got out, which he's trying to out-Kant Kant, they had an impact. Jean-Paul Sartre would take this up, just as he had, as we've seen Hegel do here. And Jean-Paul Sartre would go on to advance a very un-Kant-like conclusion about morality and freedom, although starting from an understanding of Kant. Roger Scruton's treatment of Kant is good on this. So here's the question. Is it possible at all to be an autonomous being and to be bound by morality? And Kant would say yes, and Jean-Paul Sartre and Hegel would say no. If one says, as Kant does, that morality is really autonomous, self-ruled, then there's a risk that individuals are going to become laws unto themselves. And this is why, if you recall the trolley problem we discussed earlier, why would a Kantian not pull that trolley switch? Well, precisely because, this is one reading of the categorical imperative, precisely because he could not will a world in which everyone would become a law unto themselves. That was something about which Kant worried. Now, Kant thinks that's not, in the end, a problem. He thinks that this is not going to happen because if each individual wills a universal, they're going to converge. The universal is going to be the same for all. So there's going to be substantive agreement on morality. Well, what a comforting thought. But is Kant really entitled to this comforting thought? Again, if, as he himself says, the Holy One of the Gospel must first be recognized as such, blah, 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 then why should we expect some pre-existing harmony between the law, which I recognize, the law as objectively may be in itself? Isn't recognition autonomous? If we have available anything like a categorical imperative, it would have to be an essence prior to our existence, no matter if by some happy chance our autonomous subjective awareness would just happen to converge upon it anyway. Sartre, of course, is going to deny this as strenuously as he can. His famous slogan, "Existence precedes essence," would seem to rule that out entirely, the situation that Kant describes. And for Sartre, the worst thing to do is, morally, is bad faith, making excuses, following some authority, the devil made me do it, or I had toxic parents, or the categorical imperative made me do it, for that matter. Equally pernicious, equally examples of bad faith, because we are laws unto ourselves, and no one else is, nothing else is to us. For Kant, morality just is moral universalism. Again, you know, the other formulation of the categorical imperative, when I act, I legislate for all humankind. I will the universal. And for Hegel, what's going to happen is, as Geist, and we haven't gotten there yet to define that, unfolds as he thinks it does through history, it's going to achieve universality, but right now he's at the beginning of the process, and he's exploring not the objective outcome, not the standpoint of the universal, but the particularity of subjectivity, its phenomenality, and that's where he's going to start in the text we're going to read. Sartre would have some quarrel with where Hegel ends. One cannot adopt the standpoint of the whole, Sartre says at one point. Every standpoint is the standpoint of some particular someone. Hegel starts in the right point. It's just that where he ends up is questionable from a Sartrean point of view. Again, you know, so there's an engagement there between Sartre and Kant. That's not often perceived by commentators on Sartre, but I think, again, Scruton makes a good enough case for that. Kant and Sartre are perhaps the two philosophers for whom human freedom is the most important thing. but it seems they differ greatly on what makes for freedom. Sartre seems to think uniformity of moral judgment is not a necessary outcome, and to think that there's any such convergence smacks of heteronomy. Kant's view, from Sartre's point of view, is self-defeating. Hegel's critique of Kant is that moral universality just is heteronomy. It's just the other governing us, the other in us. And for Sartre, of course, the truly autonomous being is going to reject the binding force of all such universal claims upon himself. So it looks like there's a standoff here, and Hegel and Sartre double-teaming Kant. But does Kant have any defense? Can he hold his title? Well, we can begin by asking the question, is intellectual convergence the same thing as heteronomy? Is there any distinction between contrarianism and autonomy? Maybe you've seen the meme Velociraptor. Here he is, Velociraptor, scratching his chin with his big claw. If someone tells you you should form your own opinions and you agree with them, are you still following their advice? Is autonomy just contrarianism? Well, anti-conformism may not be the same thing as autonomy. So here are all these bright young school children all dressed in their school uniforms, and they decide to rebel, not to conform. Is stopping for a stop sign heteronymous? Is refusing to stop for a stop sign autonomous? Is the stop sign just stoptional? It seems to me the problem with contrarianism is that it is just reactive, and this is a big limitation. It tries to be independent action, it's actually dependent action. David Jurowski had an interesting comment on Paul Feyerabend. He said this: like an angry ex-communist or religious apostate, Paul Feyerabend thinks that he has emancipated his mind by changing from love to hatred of the dogma that still focuses his thinking. Along the same lines, Walter Kaufmann remarks of progress and its problems. The notion that things were never so good and are constantly getting better, and the notion that things were never so bad and are steadily getting worse, are entirely worthy of each other. Yes, it's sometimes hard to oppose a thing without being cognitively victimized by the thing that you oppose. Gullibility, for example, comes in more than one flavor. There is the gullibility that believes everything, don't believe everything you think, says Maxine. But there is also diametrically the gullibility that disbelieves everything, as Cynthia Ozick reminds us. Still, cognitively captured by the dogma, but still fixates one's thinking. Kant does not pose the question of autonomy as a dilemma between individual and society. Exercising autonomy is not just a matter of saying no. Rather, for Kant, autonomy is proactive rather than just reactive. He might have said, he obviously didn't know Walt Whitman, do I contradict myself? Very well, I contradict myself. He also notes at one point, Kant does, the light dove cleaving the air in her free flight and feeling its resistance might imagine that its flight would be still easier in empty space. And of course, that's his joking metaphor. To say that the condition of autonomy is not the total absence of outside friction. Autonomy can be a matter of degree. There may be some cooperation with necessity, duty, and the needs of others, the greater good, and so forth. If I follow the categorical imperative, Kant might say in his defense, and fully agree, for example, that lying is bad, why wouldn't I wish other people to come to the same conclusion? Everybody doing the same thing is not necessarily an example of unfreedom. Being predictable is not necessarily an example of unfreedom. If everybody is following a rational course, and a rational course is the same for everybody, only you expect that they would be in some form, some sort of consensus. If what they're doing is a rational and good thing, wouldn't everybody converge upon the same conclusion about it? So yes, people sometimes do converge on inadvisable outcomes. Sheeple do agree, and that doesn't mean that everyone who agrees is a sheeple. The medieval philosophers had some words of wisdom for us, which we might recall. Abusus non tollit usum. Abusus non tollit usum. The abuse of a thing does not deprive us of its proper use. Is it possible to commit vehicular homicide? Yes. Should we ban cars? No. So, Kant might say in his defense, is there any reason to think that convergence is as such not to be desired whatsoever? Certain kinds of convergence, certain ways on certain topics, maybe not desirable. Convergence as such, that's another matter. Okay, let's look at autonomy and heteronomy. Not so much as Kant does from the standpoint of moral philosophy, but from the standpoint of social and political philosophy, which is where Hegel's going to take us. A sort of a PPE approach, politics, philosophy, and economics, the implications of this for politics and society. As it turns out, though, by the way, Hegel's examination of the political pragmatics of heteronomy does, in some cunning way, shed interesting light on Kant's moral philosophy of autonomy, too. We'll see that when we come to talk about slavery. Now, we're going to do this exploration by reading a key passage from a work that Hegel dashed off late in 1806 and published in 1807 called The Phenomenology of Spirit. And the passage in question is Lordship and Bondage, sometimes referred to as the dialectic of mastery and slavery. In order to get into that, though, we need to think about some of the weird and distinctive vocabulary that Hegel uses. And I want us to focus on 5 terms. Before them now will come to alienation, the last one down the road. These terms are phenomena or phenomenology, related terms, the term Geist, the notion of dialectic, and the concept of sublation. Let's look at phenomenology first. Hegel's book is the first one to be called Phenomenology. Later on in the 20th century, Edmund Husserl and others are going to develop a movement in philosophy by that name, slightly different than what Hegel was doing, but in general, trying to explore consciousness from the inside outward. Now, what can we say about phenomena from an epistemological standpoint? Again, this is a concept that one finds in Kant. He distinguishes between noumena, things in themselves, and phenomena, what appears to perception, and concludes that noumena are ultimately unknowable. Phenomena are all that we have. Now, this, of course, wasn't an idea original with Kant, although he does talk about it. So does Descartes, but what appearances tell us. But, of course, Plato did as well. And Plato, told us basically don't trust the appearances of subjective consciousness. They will mislead you. So Plato enjoyed the luxury of sneering at these mere appearances, worrying the attention to things as they seem to distract us from things as they really are. We're going to be mired in the realm of doxa, that twilight world of change and decay that he explores in the Republic and elsewhere. What Descartes and Kant do, though, is to deprive us of this Platonic luxury. We start from phenomena inevitably. Given that phenomenal perception sets some real limits upon metaphysical realism, does it remain possible within the limits of phenomenal perception alone to avoid the gullibility of taking mere appearance for reality? So Plato's heart was in the right place, but we just don't have the luxury that he had proceeding as he did. And as I suggested before, philosophers continue to wrestle with the fallout from Descartes and Kant. If you simply think about the debates about realism and anti-realism in the philosophy of science, you can see how there have been very many of them in recent times. You'll get the point. Okay, Hegel's focus on phenomena follows from this distinction that Kant draws between phenomena and noumena. And Hegel seems to mean that what he intends to do is to explore philosophy via a stream of consciousness, attending first to the phenomena, and this again comes from a Greek root, phino, that which appears, from the phenomena that appear to subjective consciousness. It might help interpretation here to learn that the phenomenology was originally entitled The Science of the Experience of Consciousness. Seems pretty much what he means by phenomenology. He's going to start from the subjective consciousness decidedly, and ultimately, though, he wants to go out of those bounds, and he wants to give an account, ultimately, of objective reality, of culture, the world, of history, to which he refers to by the German term Geist. So in this sense, Hegel does not out-Kant Kant, rather like Kant, or at least somewhat like Kant. He tries to reconcile objective reality with subjective consciousness, although he does it in a really different way than Kant does. One of the famous things Hegel says that seems sometimes a little mystical or even puzzling: the real is the rational and the rational is the real. one of the things I think he seems to mean by this is that individual subjective consciousness can be a microcosm for the larger reality. And so phenomenological stream of consciousness might well tell us some important things about history, for example. That's a key idea of Hegel's. So in short, he wants a phenomenology, but his phenomenology is ultimately about not just the subjective consciousness, but about Geist. And Geist is something both objective and subjective. So that brings us to that next term, Geist. It is a very complex concept. There are various meanings of the word. And I mentioned the two English translations of Hegel's phenomenology, Phenomenologie des Geistes. It's either the phenomenology of spirit or the phenomenology of mind. Mind and spirit are equally good translations of Geist. Geist also means, as it sounds close to the English word, ghost, spirit. And if you drink spirits, you are drinking Geist. And the French call it alcool blanc. The Germans often refer to it as schnapps. But you can take anything and distill it into a clear liquid. In fact, whiskey starts out that way. The reason whiskey is brown rather than clear is that it's aged in the barrels. But when it first comes out, it's white lightning, basically. And one can do this with all kinds of fruits. It's just amazing. Even hazelnuts, the weirdest one I've ever had. Tastes like, it looks like water. It tastes like filberts, hazelnuts. It's amazing. Anyway, but here we have a bottle of raspberry spirits, Himbeergeist. We can talk about the Christmas spirit, vom Geist der Weihnacht. And then there's the notion of Zeitgeist. Maybe some of you have heard of this, the spirit of the time, the spirit characteristic of an age or a generation that you had to be there. So in the 60s, free love, the notion that you could just get your freak on and not have to worry about marriage vows and that kind of stuff, that sex was good in and of itself, not simply as an attribute of social institution. So we can talk about the progressive era and the spirit of that era, spirit of reform and muckraking and so on and so forth. My favorite example, of course, having been an undergraduate at Florida State, was streaking. We started it. Princeton claimed priority, but we had a warmer climate. Basically, that's why we started in January before Princeton started. So Florida State, Tallahassee has the title. Yeah, you had to be there. It seems kind of dumb to be running around naked, but at the time it was in the air. It was the zeitgeist. So you had to be there. Geist for Hegel is a complex term. As we've seen, Geist can be mind or spirit, not merely the subjective mind of an individual, but also external collective consciousness. This is a term, of course, which comes from Emil Durkheim. Hegel doesn't use this, but might as well. It seems to be the same general idea. Also, Geist can mean God, though in an immanent sense. God moving and working his way throughout humankind in the development of world history. Hegel's term for this is Weltgeist, the world spirit. Geist as God. What an odd idea. The Weltgeist for Hegel seems to be an immanent God, one who unfolds in history, but one who is also traceable via the phenomenology of consciousness. And here we need to make a basic distinction between different ways of conceptualizing God. One can think of God as transcendent, and one can think of God as immanent. A transcendent God is one who is distinct from all creation and above it all, outside of it. An immanent God is one who is not distinct from creation, but resides in it. And there's a simple litmus test. Imagine the universe were wiped out. Would God still be there? If you hold a transcendent concept of God, you'd have to say, yes, God isn't embodied in the universe disappears, he's still outside of it. Whereas if you hold an immanent view of God and the universe disappears, well, where's God? Because the universe is where he resides. Of course, you could hold both ideas. Some people do. Geist, which is immanent in the world, evolves and develops as the world develops. This is what Hegel seems to mean by Weltgeist. And his concept of God is somewhat similar to Spinoza's, and indeed Spinoza was a direct influence upon Hegel. Now, beware, we talked about this before, be very, very cautious before ever completing a sentence, the subject of which is religion, capital R, singular, particularly if you're talking about God, capital G, singular, because ideas about God differ. They're not all compatible one with another. When most people say God, they don't use the word in the same way that Hegel is doing. Hegel's Weltgeist is immanent only. The God to which a lot of people in our world refer is meant to be both transcendent and immanent, although when people use the term God, they don't always use it consistently. Here's an interesting poll, recent poll from the Pew Research Center. Asked Americans, do you believe in God or not? 80% said yes, 19% said no. I guess 1% had no opinion. But if you probe with a further question, do you believe in some higher power? Of the 80% who believed in God, 23% said that's what God is like, a higher power. And 56% said something like, the traditional Orthodox belief in immanent transcendent God. But of the people who did not believe in God, or declared they did not believe in God, still 9% believed in a higher power. So a third of the people believe in a higher power, even though some of them are willing to call it God and some of them are not willing to call it God. But they seem to converge, and the believers in God who go that way seem to diverge perhaps from their more orthodox counterparts also claiming to believe in God. So think very carefully when you use the term God. It's subject to equivocation. It's the same word that can hold many different meanings legitimately. Could an eternal being have a biography? If you go to Amazon, you're going to find a whole bunch of books here, some with the title God, a biography, or some variation. Well, a transcendent God stands outside of all time. God is. So God's not going to have a biography. God's not going to develop. But an immanent God could have a biography. Secular history could be God's biography. God becomes, rather than is. Hegel appears to think that the course of history is the biography of God, and that he being Hegel, is the ghostwriter. There is in German literature what's known as a Bildungsroman. Bildung means development, personal cultivation, the education in the best sense. Bildungsroman, Roman means novel. It's a novel sketching self-development, a coming-of-age novel, if you will. And it's a German phrase in a German institution, but there are some examples in English too. Fanny Hill, for example, Tristram Shandy, so forth. Isn't Hegel here trying to write the Bildungsroman of Geist? And he's doing it from the inside out, exploring the phenomenology of consciousness as it evolves in the microcosm of interpersonal interaction, so as to shed light, though, on the macrocosm of history. And that brings us to the third weird Hegelian term, and that is the notion of dialectic. The term dialectic has a broad history. If you look at the 7 liberal arts that made up the original university curriculum from the Middle Ages, the trivium and the quadrivium, trivium with 3, the quadrivium 4, one of the trivium categories is dialectic, and it meant logic, and it represents more or less what we now mean by the discipline of philosophy, closest we can get. The term dialectic is used in a specific way to describe Hegel's views, and after Hegel, the Marxists have picked this up, and Marxism is sometimes referred to as dialectical materialism, whereas Hegel is supposed to embody dialectical idealism. However, when we talk about dialectic in Hegel, we need a warning label. The standard view is Hegel talks about a thesis confronting an antithesis and then leading to a synthesis. Okay, that's the sort of school expository view. Inasmuch as the term dialectic always comes up in discussions with Hegel, it might be surprising to learn, as Walter Kaufmann tells us, that Hegel never once used these 3 terms, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, together to designate 3 stages in an argument or an account in any of his books. Whoever looks for the stereotype of the allegedly Hegelian dialectic in Hegel's Phenomenology, the text we're concerned with, will not find it. So what are we to make of this? Everybody talks about Hegel's dialectic except Hegel himself. So there's a confusion, but is the confusion just purely gratuitous? I think not. The triad thesis, antithesis, synthesis was coined by Fichte, who was a Kantian, like Hegel, predecessor of Hegel, on whom Hegel drew. Kant himself used the term transcendental dialectic to describe his antinomies of reason, theses and antitheses. Hegel did use triadic structures in his explanations, and Hegel does make much of the opposition, much of the notion of opposition, which he might well have drawn both from Fichte and from Kant. So it's appropriate to use the notion of dialectic when talking about Hegel, but just not in sort of mechanistic way, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, like a robot voice. For Hegel, dialectic is a process of change. It's a back and forth process of opposition. It results in progress. Now, as I've suggested already, frankly, a lot of sheer crap has been written about dialectic in Hegel, likewise in Marx, and we're not at a loss for misleading and boring attempts to diagram it. I just went on, I Googled the notion of dialectic and looked at images, and there's some really, really bad ones. Please don't do that. I've done that for you. But here's a picture I did come across. It seems to me it captures as well as any picture could what Hegel is saying. There's kind of a spiral. You're making some progress, you're going upwards, and you're doing it by constant opposition. One of the things that we get from Hegel is that dilemmas tend to be false dilemmas often, and often dilemmas tend to issue in dynamic resolution. So if we're not too rigid about it, I mean, they're not, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, we don't do that. We can make some sense and profitably use the notion of dialectic in thinking about what Hegel's trying to tell us. If the concept of dialectic helps us think about change, about tensions and dynamic resolutions, that's good. But let's just not make it into a Procrustean bed. If you know the story of Procrustes, he had an inn between Athens and Eleusis, and he had a bed. And some people were too big for it. Some people were too small for it. He stretched the ones who were too small. He cut off the excess limbs of those who were too big. Not a good idea. And then the next concept, sublation. The German word is aufheben, and it's a kind of peculiar term in Hegel. It means to cancel, but to cancel by incorporation. I'm going to give you an example of this with which you are already familiar from earlier lectures, which Hegel does not himself use, but it seems to me a perfectly good example of what he's talking about. Remember we talked about Kant, how Kant responds to the rationalist-empiricist debate. And he basically looks at them, he says, well, it's like the blind man and the elephant. You've both got part of the picture, but not the entire picture, a pox on both your houses, but both of you have it somewhat right. Percepts without concepts are blind, concepts without percepts are empty, but we do need both concepts and percepts. So we could think of the rationalists and the empiricists as providing thesis and antithesis respectively, and Kant coming into the picture and saying basically, I want to synthesize these two notions. I want to take what's best in both and discard what's worst. Percepts without concepts are blind, concepts without percepts are empty. That's a perfectly good example of what Hegel means by sublation, cancellation by incorporation. So after you grasp what Kant's trying to say, you can no longer hold the view of Plato or Descartes. You can no longer hold the view of Locke or Bacon, straight, neat. But you can take a little bit from both and piece it together into a synthetic whole that makes more sense and is more useful. Again, dilemmas tend to be false dilemmas. Dilemmas tend to issue in dynamic resolution. Or here's another example, and again, not Hegel's example. I love roast lamb. My mother used to make a great roast lamb. She wasn't a great cook. She grew up in the 50s, and with all that implies, Betty Crocker cooked, but boy, she could roast a lamb, and I've always loved lamb, especially with a good claret. Now, here's a roast lamb. Okay, as soon as I see that, it's going to get sublated. It's going to get canceled. There'll be nothing left of that roast lamb except the bone for my dog. But it's also going to get incorporated down here. So that's sublation. You take something, you cancel it. It's not what it was before, but you also incorporate it into something new. And that's the general kind of idea I think Hegel is trying to get us to see. This kind of thing happens widely. Now, the resulting synthesis in any given dialectic might, of course, spin off other dialectics. Isn't every solution just the creation of a new problem? You solve one puzzle, it's kind of like the Hydra or whack-a-mole, and then you create some others. But, there's an ongoing thing. And then the last concept, which we're not going to take up right away, is the notion of alienation. We're going to come back to that when we talk about Ludwig Feuerbach in the next lecture, who was an interesting left Hegelian, and also very, very important to understanding the development of Marx. Now, Hegel's not the first to employ the notion of alienation. He is the first who's going to make sweeping use of it. And again, we're going to defer that until we look at Feuerbach. What sorts of things undergo dialectical development? For one thing, Geist. Weltgeist, absolute spirit, collective mind, immanent God, if you like that way of putting it. Even this is not immune from evolution and development, opposition and overcoming, cancellation and incorporation. What else undergoes dialectical development? Human consciousness. And Geist develops not apart from our development as humans, but within that development. Thus, if we're going to trace the evolution of human consciousness and the course of history, we're also going to be tracing at the same time the development of the absolute itself. At least that's Hegel's mature view. For Hegel, reality is an historical process of change, and in this respect, it might be compared with themes in pre-Socratic philosophy. If you think about, and we talked about the pre-Socratics, Heraclitus and Parmenides, the differences between them, and the way in which Plato responded to the issues that they raised. But of course, Hegel is most unplatonic. For Plato, history was a distraction from the eternal. Hegel changes philosophy by introducing history as a topic within philosophy. And after he does this, even his opponents follow suit. Even people like Karl Popper, who thinks that Plato and Hegel were among the worst things which ever happened to philosophy. Popper is the doyen of a movement called History and Philosophy of Science. That is, the notion that you can't just do philosophy of science without understanding the history of science. You can't just pontificate as Francis Bacon, for example, and others in his tradition would have done. You have to think about actual examples of how science has behaved before you come up with discourse on the scientific method and so on and so forth. And this, Popper has made, his whole following has made tremendous progress. I think that's one of the best arguments for philosophy being able to make progress that I know, and there are plenty of examples where philosophy has not made progress. But even someone like Popper, who absolutely hates Hegel, himself has to do what Hegel basically let in. So, for Hegel, unlike for Plato, first of all, history matters, process matters, the dialectic involving opposition and compromise resolution. Change is not just blind Heraclitean flux, it has a direction. And that direction can be known, both in retrospect and in advance, although hindsight is 20/20. It's easier to know it in retrospect, we'll come back to that point. Although in principle, one could see, okay, there's kind of a logic to where it was going, if we had only realized it at the time. Let's think a bit more about this, about reason, history, and of course, this takes us back to the topic of determinism, which we considered earlier in the course in discussions of metaphysics. Hegel has a book, Philosophy of History. Philosophy of History. Can there be any such thing? How? Is there some grand skeleton key to history if we can only discover what it is? The term implies that development of philosophy is tied to the development of history. For Hegel, this is the case. Geist also means mind, so the evolution of history is the evolution of consciousness. History is rational. History is the history of ideas. Now, Hegel's not the first one to suggest this. Vico earlier in the previous century did. We get the same sort of notion from some of our religious traditions, Judaism and its successor traditions, Christianity and Islam, long indebted to the idea that salvation develops gradually over human history. I will make a promise unto you, I'll make a covenant to you, etc., through what's going to take place throughout history. But for Hegel, the combination of history, capital H, and reason, capital R, is central in a way that it was never before in the history of ideas. And so after Hegel, we begin to talk also about a philosophy of history. And this is a topic you will look for in vain in earlier philosophers, Plato, Descartes, Kant, any of them. In particular, Hegel thinks that by tracing the course of consciousness as it develops, he's going to forecast where history is headed. Hegel appears to think that the course of history is the biography of God. Hegel, is its ghostwriter. Geist not only has a biography, it also has a bourgeois career. Ernest Gellner, who's a delightful essayist, you could certainly do worse someday when you have something better to do than stopping it and pulling out a collection of Gellner's essays. The Absolute Embraces, a review of Chuck Taylor's book on Hegel, is really quite a hoot, but also worth reading. This is because, in part, for Hegel, the history of spirit, of Geist, unfolding is also the history of reason, Vernunft, unfolding. They're one and the same. Now, in their own different ways, Karl Marx and Max Weber are going to develop this theme which Hegel first stated. Marx, die Vernunft hat immer existiert, aber nur nicht immer in die vernünftigen Form. Reason has always existed, but not always in a rational form, a reasonable form. And Weber, of course, is going to talk about the disenchantment of the world as a process, historical process of secularization. And of course, these two figures are very, very different from Hegel, but without Hegel, these ideas might not have come about. Hegel may have been the first to develop a philosophy of history, but he wasn't alone. Marx claims to have stood Hegel on his head, to have superseded Hegelianism. This is kind of funny because Hegel thought he superseded everything, and his was the last philosophy. Obviously, philosophy didn't end with Hegel. But Marx takes over from Hegel just this very notion of philosophy of history. So, when the Marxists try to distinguish themselves from the Hegelians, as they do, starting with young Marx himself, one has to wonder if this is not just a case of marginal differentiation. Marginal differentiation, we explored this earlier in talking about the sophists. Socrates, Plato's puts in Socrates' mouth the attempt to bend over backwards and dissociate himself from these guys known as the sophists. But in some ways, it's a distinction without a difference, just like, tobacco companies would look for, back in the days when you could actually advertise tobacco, would look for some little marginal thing. Well, Lucky's, it's toasted. Doctors recommend Lucky's. Well, doctors smoke lots of different cigarettes and all tobacco is toasted. What's the difference? But it just seems to give you, your product a little cachet. And maybe we have to ask the question, that's all that's going on here, insofar as the Marxists try to distinguish themselves from the Hegelians in this respect. And Marx would certainly downplay his debt to Hegel later, but there is some connection. Insofar as Marx also tries to read the course of history, and he does this when he talks about the transition from feudalism to capitalism and socialism, one of his key ideas, he owes this emphasis to Hegel's pioneering work in philosophy of history. As we shall see, there have been others who took Hegel, other than Hegel and Marx, who took this point of view. Robin Collingwood for one, and Auguste Comte for another. We'll come back to that. If history is predictable, then it must already be known. And this brings us back again to metaphysics, the notion of determinism. Can we anticipate history? It's a much broader and older problem than we find in Hegel and Marx. It is the problem of freedom versus determinism. Experientially, we think we have the freedom to choose. It feels like we do. But what if we choose could be predicted? And what if it could be predicted because it's in fact predetermined and therefore not really free at all? This is a problem that first comes up in theology and religious thought before the philosophy of history. If God, as tradition has it, is omniscient, all-knowing, then he surely knows what's going to happen in the future. But if so, hasn't the future already in some sense happened? God turns on his TV channel and it's all reruns. You can't surprise God. There's nothing new. He knows it all because he's seen it all in advance. And he's predestined it. He caused it to happen. If God has already predestined the future, isn't any attempt on our part to make choices just an illusion? Why try? But it's a good question. Might God, or for that matter, any other consciousness, foresee the path of history? Is history just on the iron rails going where it will inevitably go? Marx attempts to second guess the course of history, and he's often taxed with determinism for this. If Marx is right, why do we need Lenin? Why do we need a vanguard party to organize the workers if proletarian revolution is going to come about because of larger forces? Arguably, this was not Marx's view. Arguably, his view was closer to that of his colleague Hegel's, that there will come a crisis point in which socialism or barbarism will be the two options. If the proletariat is immiserated beyond a certain point, life will descend into barbarism. But it's also possible that revolt will occur and bring about a socialist society, etc. It's an interesting question. We're in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic now. And at what point will food riots break out? At what point will barbarism happen? Hasn't so far. 2 months into the crisis, we'll see. But in other words, history may be constrained without being entirely, determined along the iron rails. But this criticism of Marx is often leveled against theology too, for the same sort of reason. If everything is predestined, why try? It is from religious thought that we get the later secular ideas. First, that history is linear, not cyclical. The history might make progress, and I said 3 ideas. That an end state might be, in some sense, better than a beginning state. The Hebraic notion of salvation develops gradually over human history as one means of attempting to reconcile the immanence of God and the transcendence of God. God is above all space and time, yes, but still works within space and time, and the history of his dealings with his people said to be evidence for this. Ancient Judaism certainly developed a sense that God was working in history through his chosen people, although it also operated with the transcendent notion of God. Christianity took this over, culminating in the apocalypse. God's going to make it all right in the end. The ark, sorry. I'm sitting here in downtown Los Angeles, and that is one of our native birds flying by noisily. So, but not all religions have this idea of linear history and its fulfillment, and it's certainly not analytically the case that history should have pattern or meaning whatsoever. It might just be cyclical, as the French say, life is just a matter of métro, boulot, dodo. You get on the transport, you go to your job, you go back home and sleep. Eat, shit, sleep, repeat, as the onesie has it. What's it all about? Life might just be one damn thing after another, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. In terms of religious thought, the term that comes up here is eschatology, the branch of theology concerned with end things. And one could take this observation in a tired old direction, that is, Marxism is just one more religion, in this case, the God that failed. Or one might say eschatology can take either religious or secular form. So St. Paul seems to have expected the second coming of Christ within his lifetime. It didn't happen, obviously, we're here. Marx expected the eventual triumph of socialism over capitalism, and soon, close to his lifetime at least. Martin Luther King thought the arc of history, though it's long, bends toward justice in the end. Secular liberals typically think the best is yet to come. Marx may or may not have been a strict historical determinist, but Hegel clearly was. Hegel thought the course of history was inevitable in the way that if you could only get into the moccasins of Geist, get into some cosmic frame of reference, then the direction of the future would become clear. So Hegel knew there would be days like this. There would be days like this, Hegel said. Not many thinkers have held such a view. I mentioned Collingwood before, the idea of history. In order to understand history, history is the history of great men. You have to get inside the heads of these great men to understand what's going on. So, for example, if you want to understand the Battle of Waterloo, you have to get inside Napoleon's head and see what he was thinking. Nothing to be said here for the fog of war or breakdown in communications or anything like that. In order for this scheme to work, several things have to be true, which are not obviously true. History has to be rational. History and ideas have to be inevitably determined. History has to be the history of great men. And of course, Plato had to be correct about anamnesis, all of which are doubtful. Hegel shared this general sort of view. Whatever happens in the history of the macrocosm may be displayed as what happens in the microcosm. If an individual, could be Hegel, but it could be you and me reading Hegel, just attends to the phenomenology of evolving consciousness, and will also understand the evolution of the world and its history. And another fellow who said more or less the same thing, savoir pour prévoir, prévoir pour pourvoir, to know in order to forecast in order to accomplish was Auguste Comte, the founding father of sociology, but also the founding father of the positivist movement in philosophy, also the guy, as we saw before, who coined the term altruism. History has three stages, says Comte: theological, metaphysical, and positive. And his motto, order e progresso, order and progress, is on the flag of the Brazilian nation. Comte was very popular in Brazil, became for a while its official philosopher. He didn't live there, but they adopted him. The last stage in history, his own time, was an age of science, a positive age, in which from science comes prevision, from prevision comes action. Another way to translate savoir pour prévoir, prévoir pour pouvoir. That is, once we come scientifically to know where history is going, we can engineer it. This is a view known as positivism. Now, Marx knew about Comte, didn't like him. He referred to Geist positivismus, positivistic shit. But it looks like these guys had, doing pretty much the same thing, and so was Hegel. They were looking for that skeleton key to history, that philosophy of history. I think about each of these guys, Marx and Comte, different as they are, have three stages, just three different stages. Marx's distinction between scientific and utopian socialism seems to stake out the same ground as Comte's positivism. Now, if the philosophy of history requires forecasting, must it not also require some determinism? Like Collingwood, Hegel seems to think that the way history and consciousness have developed is the way that they must develop. So if you can rethink the process, you can understand how it happened. Think about the following thought experiment. Suppose machines could think. Now, machines can't, notoriously, what computers can't do, etc. But the artificial intelligence community tells us that basically what a computer is just a dry mechanical brain. And what we have between these two flaps of skin is a wet meat computer, and that it's only a matter of time before the dry electronic one catches up with this one here and begins to think. Okay, hasn't happened, if it ever will. Maybe it will. But supposing that R2-D2 and C3PO got consciousness, would it unfold in the same way as it does in humans? I think Hegel would have to say yes. There's a matter of inevitability. Those who speak of social engineering, certainly Marx perhaps, seem very confident in their ability to predict and foresee. And yet, while Hegel also thinks everything is predictable, he also notes that hindsight may be better than foresight. Famously, he says, "The owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of dusk." What does that mean? Who's the owl of Minerva? How does owl get in here? Well, the owl, the wise old owl, the symbol of Minerva. This is the Roman name for the goddess Athena. And here she is on a tattoo with her owl. Here she is on a coin. By the way, I wore my you can see them there. I don't know. There it is, my owl cufflink today. And the tetrachma coin from Athens. There she is on a red figure vase. The owl of Minerva spreads its wings only at the coming of dusk. Wisdom comes at the end of the process. Hindsight is 20/20. It's like Yogi Berra said, it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. And Hegel has some appreciation of that as well. Though he does seem to think there is an inevitability to the process, we can see it easier in retrospect, perhaps, than we could have in prospect. So Hegel's owl may be read as a caution against forecasting, but if history is determinate, hindsight is not only better, it's got to be close to 20/20. If it is the case that knowledge only unfolds over time through history, then those who come later will be in a better position to understand. Plato, who came along rather early, thought he'd worked it all out from the outset, so he didn't need an owl. If one thinks of Plato, philosophy as Plato does, then the earliest might very well be the greatest. And there's something to be said. Alfred North Whitehead's famous observation that all philosophy hitherto has been a series of footnotes to Plato. There's something to that, although that's not, excuse me, that's not the same thing as saying there has been no change, and maybe not the same thing as saying there's been no progress whatsoever. But even if history should have been possible to understand from the outset, Hegel unfolds it in retrospect, thus as the latest philosopher, he thinks he's also the greatest philosopher. Hegel's philosophy, if you will, sublates all previous efforts. It cancels them, but it cancels them through incorporation. Now Hegel's come along, he thinks he said everything that needs to be said. It's not Plato, it's not Aristotle, who are the greatest philosophers, it is Hegel. Hegel thought that certain individuals were at the cutting edge of Geist's progress through history. Like Beethoven, before he changed his mind, he thought that Napoleon was the cutting edge of Geist, a world historical personage. And there is an incident, apparently. Hegel, shortly after he finished the Phenomenology, the work we're going to read, walks out into the street. The Battle of Jena is about to commence. This is going to end the Holy Roman Empire, major battle. Jena was the town in which Hegel lived, the University of Jena, one of the German universities. And he walks out in the street, and there's Napoleon riding by on his white horse. And he says in a letter to a friend, Hegel, this morning I saw the emperor, the world soul, dominating the entire world from horseback. By the way, here's the horse he rode in on. I was just at the Invalides last summer again, looking for something entirely different. And I think this wasn't there the last time I was there. This is actually Napoleon's horse, stuffed, Vizier. And he was, as you can see, a very small horse. Napoleon was a very small figure and very much liked to be painted as this one here from down below, looking up at him, kind of Leni Riefenstahl before Leni Riefenstahl. But that was actually kind of a small white horse, but there it is. In their differing ways, Hegel, Marx, and Wittgenstein thought that philosophy ended with their particular philosophies. Hegel thinks that Napoleon is the Weltgeist. He might as well have looked into the mirror, because what Napoleon was to politics, Hegel was to philosophy, the cutting edge of Geist. His system of philosophy, once completed, would make philosophy no longer necessary. So, of course, we're not here today doing philosophy after Hegel, are we? Not surprisingly, not everybody goes down this road with Hegel. Here is Hegelstrasse. By the way, Europe is cool. They name their streets after philosophers. You know, in Paris, old hotel I used to stay in, spent my honeymoon there. It's now closed. It was on Rue Descartes, Descartes Street. And we have in America, we have Elm Street, Maple Street, Main Street. You know, but they actually name their streets after philosophers. How cool is that? Not everybody wants to go down Hegelstrasse, though. Hegel may be correct, he may be incorrect about his own particular role, etc. But either way, the story that he unfolds is an interesting one. And as with Plato, as with Descartes, the modern reader can draw from his phenomenology without necessarily buying into his metaphysics or his larger ambitions. Okay, let me say it in so many words. Hegel is difficult. There are neutron stars, there are black holes, and then there is Hegel. So Hegel's phenomenology is not the sort of work that you sit and read casually. You know, not even philosophy professors. This is perhaps the most typical response to reading Hegel's phenomenology. Universally, Hegel is regarded as difficult to read. You're about to see why this is for yourself. And the same thing, by the way, is true of his predecessor, Kant. Some people infer from this that we can safely ignore Hegel, that he is just obscure and there's nothing for it. Others take the view that there are some worthwhile things in there. One has to work enormously hard to discover what they are. Bloody Germans. Oh, Kant, Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche. Both the traditions of French rationalism, Descartes, for example, and British empiricism, folks like Hume and Bertie Russell and Freddie Eyre, tend to look askance at German idealism, particularly Hegel. Descartes wants clear and distinct ideas. The British empiricist tradition wants the same. Hegel doesn't give us clear and distinct ideas. And he doesn't certainly give us common sense and plain English. And he's been whipped about for this. Bertie Russell didn't like him at all. Hegel's philosophy, he says, is so odd that one would not have expected him to be able to get sane men to accept it. But he did. He set it out with so much obscurity that people thought it must be profound. It can quite easily be expounded lucidly in words of one syllable, but then its absurdity becomes obvious. Popper, as you might imagine, also not fond of Hegel. Schopenhauer, who had the pleasure of knowing Hegel personally, drew the following excellent picture of the master. Hegel, installed from above by the powers that be as the certified great philosopher, capital G, capital P, was a flat-headed, insipid, nauseating, illiterate charlatan who reached the pinnacle of audacity in scribbling together and dishing up the craziest mystifying nonsense. End of quote. And Ernest Gellner, Popper's friend, seconds the motion. When modern man speaks nonsense, the chances are more than ever that he borrows his idiom either from Hegel or from Freud. This is why the interview, which I'm going to show you a little part, between Brian McGee and Peter Singer is interesting. Peter Singer wrote a book on Hegel, also one on Marx, both very short books. In fact, the short introduction to a very short introduction series, which for those of you with some education under your belts who want to crack a specialty that you've not cracked, it's kind of an even series. Most of them are quite good. I find a lot of profit with it. I told you earlier, your education doesn't have to begin with your doesn't begin with your schooling either. It doesn't have to stop with your schooling. And here I am, as old as I am, and I'm still trying to learn some new things. And I find that this series is marvelous. There are hundreds of titles, weird sounding titles, some of them, but most of them I found that I've looked into at least worthwhile. Now I'm going to show you an interview that Brian McGee did, and this is still well worth it, and these interviews are worth watching. Slow down. These interviews are all available on YouTube. This is BBC in 1987 with, I think, 2 cameras and really badly colored sets, but the production values are not what we now expect, but just look beyond that because the content is great. He talks to some of the great philosophers of the 20th century. You know, they're still alive in 1987. The one with Freddie Ayer is particularly good, but this one is good with Peter Singer. By the way, Peter Singer is still with us. Brian McGee just died last year, but this it's so good that this was captured for us so that we can have a look now. McGee was a friend of Popper, and of course he agreed with the generally hostile view toward Hegel. Singer disagrees somewhat. But even if Russell and Popper are wrong in the general outlines of what Hegel says can be set forth in his fairly straightforward English prose, even though he didn't do that himself, is he still worth reading? And McGee asks this question, and Singer gives the following answer. Let's watch.
Now, we've been able to put this very clearly, and the next question I want to ask you is, why didn't Hegel? We said right at the beginning that he's notoriously obscure. Sometimes philosophy students read out passages of Hegel aloud just to make everybody laugh, because it sounds like such gobbledygook. You can read page after page of Hegel sometimes, think, what the hell is he saying? Now, why wasn't he clear when it's possible to be clear about his ideas, as you indeed in your book have shown?
Some of his less charitable critics thought that he was deliberately obscure in order to appear more profound, in order to cover what they took to be the shallowness of his ideas. But I don't think his ideas are shallow. I think they're very deep and profound. And that, in fact, the difficulty comes from the nature of the idea. One of his students said that whereas an eloquent lecturer might have had everything off by heart and would arrange it well and trot it out clearly, Hegel was always dredging up difficult ideas as he went along, as he lectured. He was bringing these ideas to the surface with great difficulty. And that's the style. The style is one of someone who's thinking aloud and having difficulty with the material. We may very well regret that he didn't then revise and polish it, but in the context of German philosophical style at the time, it's not so surprising that he didn't feel the need for clarity that you just mentioned, because after all, Kant and Fichte, other contemporaries, were also very obscure, and they were still regarded as great philosophers.
Yes. As a British philosopher, McGee doesn't disguise his typical disdain for ponderous Germanic verbosity and sheer woolly-mindedness, but he's going to summarize Singer's summary of Hegel, and it makes Hegel seem almost a British empiricist himself. Let's Let's listen to McGee's summary here.
If one asks oneself, what is it that's changing? Hegel's answer is, it is Geist which is changing, and you've explained what he means by that rather difficult concept, mind, spirit, whatever it may be. If one says, why is it changing? The answer is because, to begin with, it's in a state of alienation, and you've explained that. If one says, what is the process of change? What is the pattern of change? The answer is, it's the dialectical process. If you ask, where is all this change heading? The answer is, well, at the political and social level, it's heading towards an organic society, which we discussed. At the philosophical level, it's all heading toward absolute knowledge, which you at least touched. So in this way, all these central concepts of Geist, alienation, dialectical change, the organic society, all arise out of the consideration of this central idea of reality as a process, the historical process of change.
Yeah, so it is possible to put Hegel in clear, distinct terms. McGee gives a summary in 4 points. If we, Hegel at least asks some questions and answers them. Not everyone does this. Pierre Proudhon famously wrote a book called "What is Property?" And he answered the question at the end. Property is theft, but that is very rare. McGee seems to think, though, that Hegel does this too. If we ask, what is it that changes? Hegel says Geist. If we ask, why does it change instead of remaining the same? Hegel says, because to begin with, it's in a state of alienation. If we ask, what form does the process of change take? Hegel says, the dialectic. If we ask, does the process of change have a goal? Hegel says, yes, absolute knowledge, which is absolute freedom on one level, and the organic society on the other question. Of course, then McGee asks, if I can make this clear, why couldn't Hegel himself do likewise? Hegel's Phenomenology is one of the most difficult as well as one of the most important works in all philosophy. And yet it's a funny story. He dashed it off just as the Battle of Jena commenced, basically because he needed the money. He just knocked up his girlfriend, his landlord's wife, and she had a son shortly thereafter, but he needed money to pay for the kid. So he dashes off this book, and some of that shows. But it still is well worth reading and prescient in some remarkable ways concerning some of the things that are going to be said, particularly by social scientists in the 20th century, at least a century before any of them decided to say that. So we're going to turn at this point to the question, what does Hegel say? We're going to begin to read the Phenomenology. But I'm going to end this first talk on this note, and then we shall pick up in the continuation from here and begin to consider the Phenomenology.